Get started. The intent of this video is to provide a brief overview of the World War II high-altitude strategic bomber, the B-17 Flying Fortress. The airplane is considered a heavy bomber, and just due to the number of engines that it has. So a medium bomber would have 2 engines, and a heavy bomber would have 4 engines. In the United States, we produced 3 heavy bombers that fought in World War II. The B-17 Flying Fortress, like you see here, the B-24 Liberator, that was built by Consolidated, and the Boeing-built B-29 Super Fortress. Sometimes a Super Fortress is considered a very heavy bomber. The Germans, Japanese, nor the Russians, neither one of them fielded a heavy bomber, an operational heavy bomber in World War II. The airplane is also considered high altitude. B-17s during cruise combat traveled at an altitude of 24 to about 30,000 feet. You needed to maintain a high altitude to mitigate the threats of the German Luftwaffe sending up their fighter interceptors, or the other threat was the ground artillery. So the Germans got pretty good at lobbing these 20-pound shells up to 30,000 feet. They would detonate, and they were trying to hit the vital systems of the airplane. So we call those flat guns. The airplane is also considered a strategic bomber. So bombing can either be tactical or strategic. Generally speaking, the medium bombers, the 2-engine bombers, were tactical bombers. They supported ground troops. The strategic bombing means that we go after the enemy's ability to wage war. So factories, marshalling yards, submarine pens, anything that supported Adolf Hitler's war machine was considered fair game. And we tried to target those choke point industries like ball bearings or oil. The first flight of the B-17 was in 1935, which is 87 years ago, based on the year of this video, which is 2022. There are 4 engines. Those are Wright Cyclone R1820-97 engines. They each produce 1,200 horsepower. They're radial engines, which means the 9 pistons all spider out from a central hub, and they're air-cooled. The airplane has lots and lots of defensive armament, hence its nickname, the Flying Fortress. This model is the F model, that's the same as Memphis Belle, and they are armed with 11 machine guns. There's machine guns in what we call flexible mount, like our Bombardier's gun here, and then we have 2 powered turrets. We have the upper turret, and we have a ball turret gunner, which is kind of hidden. And I'll do separate videos on these stations later. One of the issues with this F model is that there's not a lot of forward-facing guns. So in the next model, the G model, they actually put a chin turret right here, and the Bombardier could operate the fire control unit of that chin turret, which gave you 2 extra machine guns down here. The airplane has a crew of 10. There are 4 officers and 6 enlisted men. So we have the pilot. He sits on the left side, the port side. And the co-pilot, who would be looking out his window here. We also have a navigator. The navigator would be, that's his windows, but he actually faces the other side, so he faces to the left. And then we have the bombardier, or toggler. So that's the Norton bomb sight, and that's his plexiglass nose that he would use for sighting when he's dropping the ordnance. So those are the four officers, and they're generally first or second lieutenants. Then we have 6 enlisted men. We have the flight engineer, who's actually the top turret gunner, and he's usually mostly responsible for fuel management of the airplane. We have a radio room operator, so this is the radio shack. He has a little hatch that he can uncouple and bring inside the airplane, lay on the floor, and then he's got a yoke. He's got a Browning machine gun he can bring out to point up in this direction. And then we have 2 waist gunners. These are hatches that go in and slide forward on a rail. You got a little flow deflector that you can pop out so you don't get air ingress into this cavity. And so we have a right and left, and then we have a ball turret gunner is hidden, and then we have the tail gunner back here. So a couple factoids about the B-17s. 12,731 were built. Most of them were built by Boeing in Seattle at Plant 2, which is actually about a mile down the road from where this model resides. Douglas out of Long Beach, California, produced 24%. And then Lockheed Vega, they're out of California also. They're out of Burbank. They produced 21%. Typical bomb load was 6,000 pounds. So we carried those inside. So we had an internal bomb bay between the wings. We don't have the view here, but there's 4 racks, and they typically carried 12 500-pound. The normal loadout would be general purpose bombs, and we'll go over bombing in great detail later. B-17s never dropped a bomb over Japan. They just didn't have the range. So when our Marines captured the Marianas Island chain where the B-29s were stationed, they were stationed on either Tinian, Saipan, or Guam. The Enola Gay was actually on Tinian. To get to Japan, that's about 1,500 miles, but you got to come back. So the B-29s had that range. The B-17s did not. Operational range, combat range on this airplane was about 2,000 miles. So I guess theoretically you could make your way to Japan, about 1,500 miles, but you couldn't come back. So they never bombed Japan. Conversely, the B-29s never bombed Nazi-occupied Europe. And Adolf Hitler should be very happy about that, given the B-29's capability. So they cruised at an indicated airspeed of 150 miles an hour at, we said, around 30,000 feet. There's a range. I'm just picking the top range. They were between 24,000 and 30,000 feet. By the way, this airspeed, this 150 miles an hour, that's indicated airspeed. When you talk about, airplanes and speeds, you have to quantify that, because there's ground speed, true airspeed, equivalent airspeed, Mach number, calibrated airspeed. So indicated airspeed is the airspeed in the flight deck. So when the pilot looks down to look at his speed, he's looking at 150 miles an hour. Now, if you want to turn that into ground speed, you got to do some math computations. And ground speed is what our Navigator, looking through, in this cavity, would be, that's the information he would need, and he has ways of doing that with drift meters and other things. That's about 240 miles an hour. So indicated airspeed of 150 miles an hour at 30,000 feet, again, pilot information, equates to a ground speed of about 240 miles an hour, assuming no headwind or tailwind. There were 400 design changes since its inception, and on future videos I'll go over some of those important design changes. The airplanes flew in a tight defensive formation, so we call that the combat box. So you start off with the 3 airplanes flying in a formation, and that's called an element. You take 2 elements, or 6 airplanes, and that becomes a squadron. You take 3 squadrons, add those together, and that becomes a group. A group and combat box, those terms are used interchangeably. So on a typical mission, you'd have 18 airplanes all arranging themselves in a combat box. And then it gets even bigger. On some of the missions, they would take 3 combat boxes and make a combat wing. So, and the reason why you flew in defensive formation, there's lots of reasons we'll go over later, but the main one is just to take advantage of the interlocking crossfire. So you arrange yourself in such a position that if you're under attack, you could have multiple guns at these stations being able to defend the entire combat box. And the Germans actually exploited this. So before they attacked one of these 18 airplane groups, they would look for the ones that were less disciplined, and those were generally the ones they would attack. And they would try to break up this formation and then go after the stragglers. The B-17s dropped more bombs in World War II than any other, we quantify this, American bomber. The British Lancaster, which was considered a heavy bomber also, it had 4 engines, they actually dropped more bombs than the B-17. There's a lot of debate on the internet about this, and I think people get confused because British identify, we talk about the tonnage of bombs, and they have short tons versus long tons. But if you work the math out, the British Lancaster dropped more tonnage of bombs than any other World War II bomber. The airplanes have a robust design. Example of that would be the self-sealing fuel tanks in the wing and multiple redundant systems. So redundancy goes into a design philosophy that when you design a system, you want to be able to take take failure of any part of that system and have it still fulfill its obligation. So for example, we have 4 engines. You can shut down one of these engines, you would feather the propeller, and you would increase the manifold pressure thrust of the other 3. You could still maintain your 150 miles an hour airspeed. So you can still stay in formation with one engine shut down. That would be a good example of a redundant system. We have 4 oxygen systems on this airplane. Your lifeblood, crew members are essentially on life support while they're flying. You have your heated suit, oxygen system. So if your oxygen system was shot out or one of the oxygen lines gave out, you could just tap into one of the other 3 systems. We have 4 generators on this airplane. Every engine has I think it's a 200 amp generator. If you could lose 1, 2 of these generators and still have enough electrical power for the systems on the airplane. So that's a good example. And Boeing has a reputation for redundancy in their design. They have a reputation for absorbing battle damage, getting the crews back to base. There's lots and lots of images on Google showing B-17s shot up pretty badly and still making their way back to Great Britain and getting their crews home. 37% of B-17s were lost during combat. So that's a pretty healthy amount. So out of the 12,731, 37% of those were lost in combat. That's not necessarily a death sentence to the crew. You could surrender. Essentially, you put your landing gear down. That's a universal sign that you're going to be compliant, and you'll just go back to a German base and surrender yourself and be a POW. Or you could bail out. You had a parachute. So there you go. A crew member had only a 21% chance of completing their 25 mission tour duty. So at the beginning of the war, beginning of our entry of the 8th Air Force of these B-17s, crews just continually flew. Morale was pretty low, so they came up with this tour duty concept that if you flew 25 combat missions, you didn't have to fly combat anymore. You were still a service member, but you didn't have to fly combat. The likelihood of a crew member completing 25 combat missions was only 21% in 1943. And I picked 1943 because that's the year in 42 where we didn't have long-range fighter escort. Once we had long-range fighter escort, then the attrition rate, dropped considerably, and you had a much higher chance of getting home. One of the first B-17s to complete this 25 mission tour duty was the Memphis Belle, and that's why they make a big fuss and made a movie about that airplane, because they could complete that. If you like this page, or if you have any other topics you want me to cover, just let me know in the comment section, and I will be happy to oblige.